going to introduce first Bryan Pickel, and it's really a great pleasure to have you here. He was a former colleague of mine at the University of Texas in the PhD program, and really happy to receive him here in Brazil for the first time. And he's now a professor at the University of Edinburgh, and his paper is going to be later commented by Gabriel Mograbi, also an old friend, professor at the Federal University of Mato Grosso here in Brazil, did his PhD at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and was a visiting student, University of Berkeley, and later on he did a postdoc, University of Ottawa, with Nordoc, and who else? Whatever. He was at Ottawa, I remember. He's the guy doing this link between metaphysics and neuroscience. And he's gonna comment this paper, a paper tomorrow, presentation, and then he's gonna present in the last day. So that's it. I think the best way to do it is you talk first, you comment, and then we're gonna open to questions, right? Thank you.
Hi, is this working? Hi, thank you for having me. Thanks to Marco, thanks to Rodrigo for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here, and also thank you guys for your great talk, which set up some issues that I'll talk about as well. So I'm going to talk about a priori knowledge, knowledge that's independent of experience, knowledge that you can purportedly acquire without experiencing the world. So some claims we have to go out and look for evidence, for empirical evidence to see whether they're true, and purportedly other claims we're able to know just by thinking about them, just by reasoning. So according to a traditional view, some truths are a priori. They have this characteristic of independence from experience, and other truths are a posteriori. They're not independent of experience. There's some fairly uncontroversial examples of a priori truths, and I say fairly uncontroversial examples because I think I don't know. I think I've created very minimal, in my own way, controversy about them, but I'm not. So some people think logical truths, like every engineer is an engineer, is a priori. You can know that just by thinking about it. You don't have to go investigate and take a survey of engineers to figure out whether they're also engineers, in the same way you would have to go out and take a survey of smokers to see if they get health problems later. Some people think definitional truths, like every bachelor is an unmarried man, or every triangle has 3 angles, are things that you don't need to go out and take surveys to figure out whether they're true. Also mathematical truths. Mathematicians don't go out and do a lot of empirical work unless they happen to be applied mathematicians. So these are all purported examples of uncontroversial a priori truths. But for some philosophers, rationalist philosophers, so especially recently Chalmers, the notion of a priori knowledge plays a really wide theoretical role. So many rational philosophers will say it explains our ability to understand expressions, to understand words like water. Part of my ability to understand a word like water is that I have various a priori knowledge about what it applies to. For example, my ability to understand water might require me to know without experience that it applies to whatever fills the lakes and rivers, that's colorless and odorless, and so forth. It might enable me to understand a word like pencil, because I know a priori that pencil applies to anything that is an instrument made for writing, made out of wood or something like that. Similarly, philosophers say it explains our competence with concepts. So rather than the word water or the concept pencil, they'll talk about the concept of water or the concept of a pencil. My competence with those concepts is purportedly explained by the range of a priori knowledge I have about them, or is at least tied to these things. I think in Chalmers' work, you see this with his two-dimensionalism. One of the central ideas there is our ability to understand a word or understand a concept consists in our ability to apply it to a certain situation in light of a description. It also purportedly underlies reasoning about possibility. We saw this in the last talk where There's a question about whether zombies are conceivable, whether they're epistemically possible. And that's one way of asking that question, is to ask whether zombies are epistemically possible given the physical situation. One way of understanding that question is to ask, does a description of the world in physical terms a priori rule out a description, rule out the claim that there are no zombies? Okay. So that's a traditional picture. There are these a priori truths, there are some uncontroversial cases, and then there are more controversial cases that underwrite these rationalist projects. But sort of in the middle of the last century and later, there were a lot of challenges to this traditional picture. So Quinean arguments from revisability put lots of pressure on the view that there are these substantive a priori truths, these a priori truths that go beyond the simple examples. Externalist arguments developed by Putnam and Kripke also put pressure on these substantive a priori truths. So just to get the flavor, you might have thought that it's knowable a priori that water is a colorless, odorless liquid that fills the lakes and rivers, et cetera, et cetera. But we could easily find out, says Quine, or would say Quine, that water doesn't fill the lakes and rivers, something else does. We could easily find out that we've been deceived. Analogously, if you thought that pencils were instruments made for writing, Putnam, you might have thought that was a priori, but Putnam points out that it's at least conceivable, that we find out that some of the things we thought about pencils were wrong, and they're actually animals that sort of disguise themselves and we write with them. So they weren't made for anything. Okay, so, sorry, I've stolen a picture from Dave from his website. So recently, Dave Chalmers has argued that the range of a priori truths greatly exceeds the least controversial cases discussed above, and this a priori knowledge suffices for the neo-rationalist project, so it goes beyond logical and maybe even simple definitional truths and mathematical truths to give us we have some substantive a priori knowledge, just in the sense of it's non-logical, non-mathematical. And he has this really interesting spin on a very traditional argument that we need a priori knowledge. So the very traditional argument says, my evidence consists in my experience or my basic knowledge of my little corner of the world, but I know stuff beyond my little corner of the world. How is that possible? And the old-fashioned argument says, well, I've got to have a priori knowledge linking facts about my corner of the world to the world at large. Chalmers has a very similar argument. He says, we have all sorts of ordinary knowledge. I know things about tables and chairs and mountains and water and pencils from some core evidence, facts about the distribution of primary and secondary qualities in the world, facts about the distribution of colors and shapes and textures and atoms. That's my core evidence, and from that, I'm able to infer facts that there are mountains and tables and chairs, and that water covers the majority of the earth. So these are things I've inferred from my core evidence. So what Chalmers wants to do is similarly argue to this traditional line that means that the evidence, the whole of my core evidence, entails the ordinary truth that I can infer from it, that I know on the basis of that core evidence. So it a priori entails. So there's an a priori link between my core evidence and all the things I know on the basis of my core evidence. So that's the argument that's the sort of traditional argument, and then he's going to give his really interesting spin developing that. So in particular, he's going to argue that conditionals like the following are knowable a priori. They're knowable independently of experience. You don't need experience to verify them. Okay. Following him, called the front-loaded conditional, and we'll see why. So if D, so D is the antecedent, the majority of the earth is covered by a substance that fills lakes and rivers, that is wet, that speakers refer to as water, that produces precisely these sensations and satisfies precisely the test for being H2O, and so on. So that's the antecedent. What I can know is, if that's true, then water covers the majority of the earth. Where and so on is to be filled out by a comprehensive description of all my core evidence. Crucially, that core evidence won't include facts about water. Otherwise, this conditional risks being a logical truth, because we don't want to say if water covers the majority of if water covers the majority of the Earth and blah blah blah, then water covers the majority of the Earth. That's a relatively uncontroversial a priori truth. Chalmers wants a more substantive one. So the range of the core evidence he's going to specify isn't going to include facts about water. So he wants to argue that this conditional is knowable a priori. Okay. In principle, one's supposed to be able to reason from the supposition of the antecedent of the conditional to the consequent of the conditional. So it should be consequent. So if I suppose that the antecedent is true, I should be able to rationally have high credence and consequent. If I suppose that D is true, I should be able to rationally have high credence that S is true as well. And the reasoning I use is supposed to be, you require no empirical information. And the basic idea is all of the empirical information has been specified in the antecedent of the conditional. So what else could I need to infer the consequent of the conditional from the antecedent other than what's already specified? So once I suppose that the antecedent of the conditional is true, there's no other empirical information needed to infer the consequent. Okay, so what I'm going to do is talk about two arguments that Chalmers offers that this reasoning is rational, even independently of all one's empirical beliefs, even if one suspends all of one's empirical beliefs. So this is not quite right. I'll offer a challenge to each of these arguments. So I'm going to offer a challenge to the argument, I'm going to offer a challenge to these arguments that show that the reasoning is rational independently of experience. I'm going to say the reasoning subtly depends on experience. Okay. So I'm going to first very generally talk about the front-loading argument a little more. Then I'm going to talk about one argument, which we'll call the argument from reverse conditionalization. Then I'll talk about another argument, which we might call the argument from supposition. And then I'll conclude by talking about some reasons for thinking that our knowledge of the conditional is a posteriori and not a priori. Okay. So Chalmers observes that one can know a claim like S, that water covers the majority of the Earth, on the basis of D. So a complete description of the primary and secondary qualities in one's environment, which may mention but not use the word water. So we can know S on the basis of D. We don't use the word water because we don't want if D then S to be a logical truth. Okay. So the idea is I can have rationally high credence, a high degree of belief or confidence in S in light of having acquired total evidence specified by D. So this is a little technical, but we don't need to get bogged down in the details. So Chalmers uses sort of a probabilistic notion of belief. So he models a Credo state as a probability function, CR. So your credence assigns values between 0 to 1 to all the claims you might believe. So if your credence in a claim is 0, that means you're certain it's false. If your credence in a claim is 1, that indicates it's certainly true. And if your credence is in between, then you have some intermediate level of confidence. And in addition to absolute credence, my degree of confidence that some claim is true, so I might have a degree of confidence that it will rain tomorrow, I also have a degree of confidence that it will rain conditional on some other claim. So if it's cloudy, that's going to raise for me my confidence that it will rain tomorrow, right? So in addition to this notion of my credence that it will rain tomorrow, we have this notion of my credence that it will rain tomorrow given that it's cloudy, my conditional credence. So that's your credence in a claim on the supposition that some other claim is true. Okay. So Chalmers is going to argue for what he calls the front-loading principle on the basis of the fact that we can have high absolute credence in S having acquired certain evidence D. So I've gone through life, I've acquired certain core evidence, and on the basis of that core evidence, I rationally have high credence in S. And what he wants to argue is, if I have high credence in S, justified by D, then I can have a high conditional credence in S given D. So my credence in S on the supposition that D should be justified independently of D. And if this front-loading principle is true, one can know a priori that if the conditional, that if D is true, then S is true. The reason is, and we don't really need to get into the details, that your credence in a conditional is always higher than the conditional credence given some assumptions. Okay, so basically, if my credence in S given D can be high, then my credence in the conditional, if D, then S is high as well. Okay, so I'll talk through two arguments for what we've called the front-loading principle. One is, I'll go over rather quickly, the reverse conditionalization argument. The other one I'll go over more slowly, the belief suspension argument. So the reverse conditionalization argument purports to show that my credence in S given D is independent of all my empirical evidence D, because I could rationally have a high credence in S given D temporally or prior in time to acquiring any empirical evidence. So it's motivated by reversing this principle about how we should revise our beliefs. So conditionalization is a principle about what my credence in a claim S should be, given that I prior had so if I have a prior credence in S given D, and I acquire evidence D, what should my credence in S be? Conditionalization, we don't need to get into the formal details, but conditionalization, if I have a certain credence in S given D, so if I have a certain credence in S on the supposition that D, and I acquire evidence D, my new credence in S should be equal to my old credence in S given D. So if I give S a certain credence, if I give the claim that it will rain a certain credence on the supposition that it's cloudy, and I find out that it's cloudy, then my new credence that it will rain should be equal to my prior credence that in the claim that it would rain given that it's cloudy. Okay, so conditionalization is a forward-looking principle. It says, if I have certain conditional credence in S given D, and I acquire evidence D, then my new credence should be the same as my new credence in S should be the same as my old credence in S given D. Chalmers looks for a backward-looking principle that says, if I find myself with a certain credence in S after having acquired certain evidence D, so here I am, I have a certain degree of confidence in S, I have a certain degree of belief in S, I have that degree of belief after having acquired evidence D. That means that prior to acquiring evidence D, I should have had a conditional credence. I should have had a high conditional credence in S given D. So conditionalization goes one way. It says if I have a high conditional credence in S given D, and I acquire evidence D, I should wind up with a high credence in S. Reverse conditionalization goes the other way. It says if I have a high credence in S, having acquired evidence D, we can now infer something about how I was before I had a high credence in S given D. So reverse conditionalization says that if I arrive at a high credence in S by acquiring evidence D, I must antecedently have had a high conditional credence in S given D. So that means that given that I now know S on the basis of acquiring D, I must have, prior to acquiring any evidence, had a high conditional credence in S given D, and therefore I'm rationally justified in believing S given D independently of experience. So my knowledge of if D, then S is a priori. Okay, very generally, the worry about this argument is that Chalmers is aware that conditionalization doesn't entail reverse conditionalization. He talks about that. So in particular, one's conditional credence in S given D may be undefined prior to acquiring evidence D. Conditionalization just tells you about it's just a forward-looking principle. Reverse conditionalization is a backward-looking principle. It doesn't say anything about what my credence in S given D was prior to acquiring D. It might not have been defined. Chalmers himself, in his book Constructing the World, which is where all these, constructing the world, which is where all these arguments come from, considers one possible explanation for this. Maybe one lacks the relevant concepts in S, so maybe before acquiring experience, before having any experience, I didn't have the concept of water. And that would be interesting, but I mean, I think Chalmers reasonably discounts that as relevant to his rationalist project, because that's a difference. That's an enabling condition, not a justification condition. But what I want to say is there's a host of other reasons for suspecting that credence prior to acquiring any empirical information aren't defined. In particular, very few versions of Bayesianism require that one's credence in S given D is defined if one's credence in D is 0. So if I'm absolutely confident that 2 plus 2 is 4 and not 5, then many versions of Bayesianism will say the claim that there is no such thing as my credence that it will rain tomorrow given that 2 plus 2 is 5. I don't have a credence. I don't have a credence like that. I just can't suppose that 2 plus 2 is 5. So I can't suppose my credence that 2 plus 2 is 5 is 0. So my credence that it will rain tomorrow given that 2 plus 2 is 5 is undefined. And I want to say there are uncountably many epistemic possibilities. Prior to having any experience, I have no idea what the world could be like. So there's just too big of a range. There's just too big of a range of what's epistemically possible. So the probability of any one epistemic possibility being true, any one D being true, is 0. So one's conditional credence in S given D requires to conditionalize on a claim one has 0 credence in. Okay, so there's no reason to expect that prior to learning D, so my view is there's no reason to expect that prior to learning D, I had any credence in S given D. Okay. Now, there are people who do hold that you can conditionalize on something you have 0 credence in, but very often it hardly follows that every conditional credence must be defined in every credal state. And very often, even if you can sometimes conditionalize on a claim you have 0 credence in, even many of these approaches won't allow you to always conditionalize on a claim you have 0 credence in. Okay. So I'm going to move to what I view as the more important argument, the belief suspension argument, which I think is like really interesting. It's where most of the action is. So Chalmers' belief suspension argument, again, takes as a premise that I can have a high credence in S, a high degree of belief in S rationally, on the basis of having learned total information specified by D. So I've learned D, and on that basis, I have a high credence in S. I've learned that a colorless, odorless liquid that satisfies the H2O tests, etc., covers the majority of the Earth. And on that basis, I have a high credence that water covers the majority of the Earth. So Chalmers, I'm going to completely concede, he's right. We are able to know things like S, that water covers the majority of the Earth, on the basis of total empirical evidence that doesn't mention anything about water, doesn't use the term water. Chalmers wants to argue that because of that, this is what I can do. I can suspend my belief in D. I can bracket all my empirical beliefs. And then I can ask myself, in this suspended state, suppose D were true, would S also be true? So suppose, I could suspend all the ideas, I could suspend all my beliefs, and then I could ask myself, suppose I learned that a colorless, odorless liquid called water that has H2O molecules, etc., covers the majority of the Earth. Would it follow that water covers the majority of the Earth? Chalmers wants to say yes. The agent could rationally have a high credence in S on the supposition that D. So the idea is even suspending all of our empirical beliefs, the agent could reason their way from D to S, and that's supposed to show that the conditional if D then S can be reasoned to a priori, independently of experience, because we're in a state where we've suspended all of our empirical beliefs. Okay, so Chalmers concludes that the high credence in S given D doesn't depend on the total evidence specified by D. I can have a high credence in that independently of D. Okay, Chalmers views the, so I think Chalmers views the third step in the argument as the most important, or the most controversial. That one could reason one way from D to S, even after suspending your belief in D. So what I think in some of the existing debates on this, what's viewed as the most what's been the most contentious is that I could infer that water covers the majority of the Earth from the supposition that a colorless, odorless liquid with all these features covers the majority of the Earth, even if I suspend all my empirical beliefs. So that's one of the more controversial. So Ramnetta specifically has objected. He says if I suspend my empirical beliefs, then I can't reason my way from D to S. Chalmers has responded, but look, if this sort of reasoning is justified in the knowledge room, so if it's justified, if my reasoning from my evidence D to the conclusion of S is justified in the knowledge room when I'm acquiring knowledge S, why isn't it also justified in the supposition room? Suggesting that the credence in S given D is that the high credence in S given D is rational, even independent of D. So why, if it's rational to do it when I'm learning facts about the world to infer S from my basic evidence D, why isn't it also rational when I've suspended all my beliefs to infer S from D? And I think that's a reasonable challenge. Oh, sorry. Okay, so by way of contrast, I want to defend a line of thought that I associate, I think, with Laura Schroeder, according to which D can play a role in justifying both S and the fact that S follows from D. So the evidence I have, D, can play a role in justifying both my belief in S and the fact that S follows from D. So it can justify both S and, if D, then S. Another way of putting that is justification relations are a posteriori. Okay, so here's Schroeder. She says, ideal epistemic methods for updating beliefs suggest that empirical information about relevant token representational states must be both included in D and known to be actually true for a high conditional credence in S given D. So this is a bit complicated, but I'll try and so it's something like the fact that D is actually true is also playing a role in justifying the high conditional credence in S given D. So there's some empirical information that justifies the high conditional credence in S given D. And I think, so in their exchange, Chalmers responds, well, whatever that information is could still be front-loaded into D. So take whatever information that Schroeder says is required to infer S from D and just put that in your total empirical information. So now the question is, could she suspend judgment about K and then so if a subject can reason from D to S with background justification K, then in principle she could suspend judgment about K, sorry, this is, I think, flubbed, and come to be justified in believing that if D and K were true, then S would be true, and that would still be substantive a priori knowledge. So you could just put what additional empirical information there is into the antecedent. That's why it's called front-loading, is you front-loaded or put all of the information into the front of the conditional. So in contrast, I claim that all the reasoning still covertly depends on D for its rationality. And the reason I want to think this is I think belief suspension, the act of suspending belief, is a species of contraction. It's a species of going from a high information state, an information state where we have lots of beliefs, to a low information state where we take fewer things as certain, fewer things as believed. So I go from having all this empirical information to having a smaller belief set, and then I see whether I can still infer S from D. So I think in order to see whether the argument entails that one can know a priori, or one can independently of experience have a high credence in S conditional on D, we've got to talk about what belief contraction is. We've got to talk about what it is to have a belief state and shrink it and remove information from it, because that's really what belief suspension is. So just a little bit of formalism following Yardenfor's knowledge in flux. So I'm just going to represent the fact that we've removed information A from a Credo state by putting a minus A on it, and the fact that we've added information to a Credo state by putting plus A. Conditionalization tells us that learning A, or acquiring the information that A, my credence in P, acquiring the information that A, should be equal to my prior credence in P, given the supposition that A. Okay. So now the question is, what is belief contraction? Yardenfor's, I think, states the problem rather well. The problem concerning belief contractions of belief sets is that when retracting a belief A from a belief set K, there may be other beliefs that entail A. So if I want to remove some information A from what I believe, I've also got to remove all the things that entail A. So if we want to keep the contracted state closed under logical consequence, which probabilistic approaches do, it's necessary to give up other beliefs as well. So just to see how this works, suppose I believe that B, and I want to reduce my credence in B below 1. But suppose I also believe that if A, then B, and A, then at least one of those beliefs, at least one of those credences must be reduced below 1, and maybe both. And then the question is, how much information has to be removed so in removing A, how much additional information has to be removed? And the problem is made worse in probabilistic contexts, where purely probabilistic connections between beliefs might really underdetermine what it is to remove information from my belief, or from my Credo state. So basically, so the general problem is lowering credence in A from 1 often also requires lowering one's conditional credence in A given B from 1, even where B is not logically connected to A. Okay. So what's wanted is some principle about how much information we should contract. And Yardenfor's, speaking for the AGM framework, suggests a principle of information economy. The retraction should be in some sense minimal. So when I shrink my belief state, I shouldn't shrink too much. So he says, we want the criterion of information economy to also apply to contractions, so that no belief should be given up unnecessarily. So if I believe that it will rain tomorrow, and I suspend my belief that it will rain tomorrow, I shouldn't thereby also suspend my belief that 2 + 2 is 4, or that I'm standing talking to all of you. My belief contraction should be minimal in that way. And this is a guiding thought that in some ways is very amenable to Chalmers' project. In particular, the AGM framework has a substantive view about what happens when we suspend our beliefs and then reintroduce those beliefs as suppositions. So what happens when we subtract the information that A from our belief sets and then put it back in? In the AGM framework, they take the principle of informational economy to support the view that if I suspend my belief in A, take out the information that A, I should do so minimally, so that if I put the information that A back in, I get back the same belief state. So this is known in their framework as the recovery postulate. It says, if I suspend my belief in A, then I can recover my original Credo state by bringing A back in. In this form, in its most general form, the recovery postulate is controversial. But I want to flag that even opponents of the recovery postulate, such as Levy, believe in some form of the principle of informational economy. What they disagree about is what informational economy amounts to. But I want to flag that there's an important way in which this recovery postulate is helpful for Chalmers. So Chalmers imagines a subject suspending all of her empirical evidence specified by D, and then reasoning from the supposition that D to something else she previously believed at S. And the conclusion was supposed to be that the high conditional credence in S given D was justified independently of D, since it could be arrived at after suspending belief at D. Okay. So the suspension of my belief that D will be represented by this guy, CR minus D. Chalmers asks, what happens if the subject who suspends their belief in D supposes that D? So this should get me back to the state CR minus D plus D S. So what is my credence in S, given that I've suspended my belief that D and then reintroduced D as a supposition? Well, the recovery postulate gives us an answer. That just is my original credence in S. Given the recovery postulate, suspending one's credence in D and then reintroducing D as a supposition should allow one back to a high credence in S. And that's exactly what Chalmers says it should do. But now here's the worry. The recovery postulate, the recovery axiom, is justified by the idea that the contraction should be minimal. So given that I'm in a state where, given that I've acquired information that D, when I suspend my belief in D, I should do so minimally. I should change as little as possible. So one's Credo state that results from contracting on D is not some unadulterated, some pure, innocent Credo state. It's not necessarily the Credo state I was in before acquiring evidence D. Rather, it's the minimal mutilation of my current Credo state by taking information out the D. So I find myself with information D. So it's not that I had some pure Credo state before I acquired all my empirical information, and then when I suspend my belief in D, I'm back to this pure angelic Credo state. It's rather, Edenic might be helpful using. It's rather that I find myself with this information that D, I find myself an agent in the world who has all this empirical information, and I want to know what would happen if I give up my belief that D, and what I have to do is figure out what is the minimal way I could alter my belief set to take out the information that D. And that means that, from my perspective, the ability to reason from D to S in the suspended Credo state doesn't show that the entailment from D to S is knowable a priori. Rather, it shows that I have left enough information, I've left enough empirical information in my belief set that I can get from D to S. So you might think of this as follows. This isn't in any way realistic, but I have certain core evidence, like there's a wet sensation in my arm, lakes and rivers and streams are filled with colorless, odorless liquid, speakers use the sound water in the presence of the odorless liquid, and so on. And I have all these beliefs on this basis, like water is causing the wet sensation, or water's on my arm. Water fills the lakes and streams and rivers. Water is a colorless, odorless liquid. Water is whatever is same substance related to the samples called water around me, and so on. When I suspend all my empirical information, I don't get back the state I had prior to acquiring any information. Rather, what's left in my belief set is certain claims that collectively enable me to reason from D to S. In a probabilistic context, you might think, I might have started out life without having any well-defined conditional credences, but I've got all this information D that gives me a high credence in S. Now I suspend my information D, and that leaves me that even though I don't have credence 1 in D anymore, I still have a bunch of credences and conditional credences I didn't have prior, and those collectively enable me to have a high credence in S given D. Okay, so that's generally my response to Chalmers' belief suspension argument, namely that even if I can reason from D to S in the suspended Credo state, that doesn't mean that the reasoning is a priori. So very briefly, I want to go over a possible way to consider, a possible way it might not be a priori, a possible argument. And that's that I think it's at least conceivable that reasoning in these suspended Credo states varies with the empirical information I have. So I'll just very briefly explain what I mean. So it would be plausible to hold that the suppositional reasoning is empirically dependent if the rationality of the reason could be shown to vary with my background empirical information. Sorry. So this would involve showing that the legitimacy of the suppositional reasoning is sensitive to the real-world information of the rational agent. And this is roughly what Laura Schroeder says should be the case if her picture is correct. Okay. The question is, so here I am. I have a certain belief in D. I've acquired certain evidence D. I suspend my belief in D, and then I reason my way from D to high credence in S. The question is, suppose someone else doesn't have information D, but has different information D star. Could they suspend their belief in D star and then reason their way from the supposition that D to a high credence in S? And more particularly, must they do so? Once they suspend all their empirical beliefs, is it going to be necessary that, is it going to be the only rational thing for them to do that upon supposition that D, they'll conclude with a high credence in S? This would, if not, if someone else's credence was differed from my own, this would imply that one's ability to rationally deduce S from D in a suspended belief state is dependent on one's background information. It's dependent on the way it's dependent on the information one suspended. And it would thus make it less plausible that the inference is a priori. Okay. So the question I want to briefly ask is whether there could be two Credo states with core evidence D1 and D2, which yield different results when they suspend their empirical evidence and then engage in the suppositional reasoning. So I believe in D1. I have evidence D1. Gabriel has evidence D2. Suppose I suspend my belief in D1. Gabriel suspends his belief in D2. And we each ask ourselves, suppose D were true, would S be true? And what I want to ask is it possible that we rationally come to different views? Schroeder has suggested that it could, that different experiences could constitute empirical, that we could have different views about whether anything of a certain empirical kind is water. So she imagines agents with, I think the orders. She imagines agents with different experiences. In particular, these agents find that the members of their community use the word water to pick out a manifest kind rather than a natural kind. And she suggests that, I'm not sure how the order got messed up. She suggests that these experiences constitute empirical, that the possibility of these experiences would constitute empirical evidence that anything of the manifest kind is water. So you could have an example, you could have a case like this. Someone has all this empirical evidence that speakers use the sound water in the presence of a colorless, odorless liquid. Other speakers don't care about the composition of water, of what they call water. And this person comes to believe that water is a colorless, odorless liquid if it exists, and that a substance material constitution, whether it's H2O, is irrelevant to whether it's water. So we imagine a person in that belief state, and we ask them to suspend all of their core evidence, and they might still wind up with a very radically different creedal state than my own. They might still believe that a substance material constitution is relevant to whether it's water. So now we describe D to them and ask them, would S be true? And they say, well, who cares whether there's H2O there? Who cares whether all that matters is whether there's a colorless, odorless liquid. So the basic picture is, on Schroeder's view, there are different experiences we could have that would lead to different results when we engage in this suppositional reasoning. And that's, if you take her cases seriously, which I do, that's some reason to believe that the beliefs are empirically dependent. Okay. So very briefly, going over Conclusion, Chalmers' front-loading arguments purport to establish that one may have a high conditional credence in S given D independently of any experience, and therefore we have a priori knowledge that if D, then S. And if that's right, then Chalmers gets out very far-reaching rationalist implications because he'll get out what I think of as substantive cases of a priori knowledge. But I've argued that the front-loading arguments aren't successful. In particular, the reverse conditionalization argument relies on the reverse conditionalization principle that we have reason to doubt, and the argument from supposition is not successful because I think the suspended belief state, when I suspend my belief state, that doesn't leave me in a pure uncontaminated belief state, but in a belief state that retains empirical information. So my ability to reason from D to S doesn't show that my knowledge is independent of experience. So thanks.
Do I start? Oh, okay. So first, congratulations to Bryan Pickel. I want to thank the invitation. I think this group is doing a great job organizing conferences. The International Conference of Philosophy of Mind, part of the work group in Philosophy of Mind of our national postgraduate institution, association, wherever. Yeah, association. And also, congratulations for both of your talks, Marco and Rodrigo. Those are very thrilling talks. So I haven't access to Pickel slides in advance, but I have access to his 2016 philosophical quarterly paper. And as the paper is very long and technical, I've read it 3 times, twice before coming in to refresh some content just after lunch today. So instead of doing my kind of Fred Astaire presentations, I'll be seated here and I'll read my notes, okay? Because the paper is very long, very technical, and I'll even approach some of the subjects that he passes very fastly through, and I'll try to give some light to those subjects as well. Even if I'm more sympathetic to the kind of strategy Pickel defends, because I'm hardcore materialist and empiricist, I'll try to defend some of the Chalmers positions as well, because I'm just here to promote the debate. I'm not here to defend my positions. So I try to make a kind of master of ceremony type of commentary. So I want to make some, in the beginning I'll do more general notes, actually even to easy the perception of the extent of the critique, and then I'll go for some technical details. So Pickel characterizes Chalmers' general strategy as an attempt to show that our ability to make a judgment about a world, whether considered as possible or as actual, that's very important. It seems that Chalmers opens the scope, and he's talking about possible, both about possible and actual, based on the condensed description of that somehow reveals that one has a priori knowledge linking the content of the judgment to the content of the condensed description. Skip some part here. To support this conclusion, Chalmers argues that the reason is rational if one suspends beliefs in all of our core empirical evidence. Chalmers concludes that the truth or falsity of most so generic claims is a priori inferable from a comprehensive description of the core evidence in terms of a privileged vocabulary. Actually, I would like to know from Chalmers exactly what characterizes the privilege of this vocabulary. That would be a great, because I think it's not a core characteristic of the account, but it seems there a very important, is a very important feature of the vocabulary. Okay. Then what I'm just characterizing the way that Pickel presents Chalmers' position so far. So Pickel shows that Chalmers' more sophisticated version of this argument in a great extent depends on to the notion of belief suspension. The condition was supposedly a priori because agents who suspend their empirical beliefs can rationally deduce as from the Chalmers belief suspension argument, and now I'll quote Pickel, makes it difficult to see how the empiricist and the serialist challenges to this project, as for example in Bloch's and Stonecker, and especially in Laura Schroeter, could possibly work. So long as it's conceded that the reasoning from D to S is rational, even in a context when each belief in D has been withdrawn, how can one deny that the reason is a priori? I think Pickel was very economic and gentle here. We could characterize that as saying that Chalmers is circumstantially begging the question against empiricists or externalist accounts. The way that he phrases the question makes it impossible, in principle, for someone that is empiricist or externalist to defend any position, to say anything. I don't know if that's true. I'm just provoking here the discussion as Bryan was very economic and careful not to say exactly the same words. I want to see if he would endorse something like that, if Chalmers would accept something like that. Bryan proposes that careful thinking about belief suspension reveals just how empirical informations can contaminate the reason from D to S, even in contexts when each belief D is suspended. That is, on closer inspections, the models for example, Bloch and Chalmers or Schroeter will be much more reasonably defensible that Chalmers, then Chalmers took it in the discussion. Bryan argues that the belief suspension is best understood as a species of belief contraction in each one transitions from high information state to a low information state, as one transitions from a high information state to a low information state. And the contractions is used in the sense of the AGM framework, Alturon, Gardefons, and Marxen. Okay. Pickel then defends belief contraction should minimize information loss. So even if a full belief in D is suspended, many downstream effects of this belief can be retained in the suspended belief state. Since the inference from D to S can smuggle in empirical information, he argues that the neo-rationalists have not proved that it is a priori. Moreover, he says, I suggest that this is the best way to understand empiricists and externalist lines of resistance to the sort of neo-rationalism. One result of this paper is that empiricists and externalists may freely appeal to standard thought experiments that involve revisions of current beliefs without having to concede that these thought experiments make use of a priori principles. Okay, that's a point that he didn't during the slides, but is a point that he strongly makes during the paper. I just read his text now. I'll skip the part about front loading because I think it was pretty well characterized. And I think there's no much of a discussion. It's there, it's Chalmers' text, he quotes. But I think it's important to notice that I think Bryan understands front-loading as a Chalmers' strategy to bring all the information to the antecedent, and he treats that a little bit as a trick. Not with these words, but yeah, something like that. Yeah. So okay, now I want to explore two quotations of Bryan as well from the paper that I think are really important. One of them will give chance to Chalmers to block Bryan's argument. First one is the one about the two agents that have Credo states that could be different. I think Bryan make a very strong point here. It'll be really a strange coincidence in the real world if the recovery in both cases was exactly the same. I think it will be very hard to defend a an identity here. So I think it's a good point. It would be very strange that given that those two subjects would have different spatial temporal locations, that they have access to different aspects of the world, that they will recover their Credo states exactly in the same way. It would be a strange coincidence. So I think that's a very good point that Bryan makes. But the argument that I think it's the most important is all these argument depends, and now I'm quoting Bryan, if belief contraction is governed by the principle of information economy, then CR1 less D is the state that minimally changes CR1 by removing D, and CR2 less D is the state of minimally changes CR2 by removing D. There is no reason to expect this to be the same, so there is no reason to expect the suppositional reason to be insensitive to one background's empirical formation. I agree with that, but that depends on the first premise, if belief contraction is governed by principle of information economy. I could imagine someone as a full-fledged metaphysician as Chalmers saying, I don't have to buy the principle of information economy. I'm not the type of guy that buys the principle of information economy. I mean, this is a position that wouldn't make any sense or not endorse the principle of information economy. I would endorse, and I agree with Bryan, but I can't see a way out for Chalmers here because he could have just said that the principle of information economy is not something very meaningful to him. It's something exogenous to his account. That's one important point. There's, I don't know how much time I got lost with time because, how many more time? 5 minutes, okay. So, another point that I think is very important during Bryan's argumentation is that the contamination, he would assume that he quotes Chalmers. Chalmers rightly concedes that this fails to establish, I have to say what, Chalmers spends a great deal of time arguing, I'm quoting Bryan, for a thesis that he calls conditionals credibility, that one may rationally have a high credence in S given D, presumably without having knowledge of D. But Chalmers rightly concedes that this fails to establish that the knowledge is empirical and contaminated. And he quotes Chalmers, the obvious worry is that armchair knowledge does not entail a priori knowledge. Conditionals credibility allows that the justification of conditional belief and rational conditional credence may depend on the subject's existential empirical evidence and beliefs. So I think Bryan was pretty able to find some part of a text with which Chalmers concede that armchair argument, and in a sense there are a argument that is done without empirical evidence does not entail a priori knowledge. That's a very important passage, I think, as well. I would like to see them discussing this passage as well. It's just here to promote debate. So my main 2 points here is, if armchair argumentation does not entail a priori argumentation, that will be a evidence that the type of argumentation that is given, withdrawing all the content, will be a form of armchair philosophy. Will be a form of, or there will be a priori philosophy. Because, I mean, obviously, as I said before about a possible defense for Bloch and Staunecker and for Lara Schreiter, if you withdraw the content, you obviously withdrawing the physicalist from the discussion as well. Something similar to what Marco said. So those are I think those are the most important points. Sorry if it was a little bit confusing, but I think this is enough to start the debate. Thanks.
Should I take a brief minute to respond to Gabrielle? Yeah, well, yeah, so thank you. You've said a lot of things more clearly than I have. I think the most worrying thing you've pointed to is Chalmers might reject the principle of information economy. So he might say, belief suspension doesn't involve minimally mutilating my belief set, doesn't involve the minimal withdrawal of D. I guess very briefly what I want to say, sorry, I'm going back to it. Very briefly what I want to say about that is that would be fine. What I've given is a model where I can agree with everything Chalmers says about belief suspension, namely that I can suspend my belief and then I can reintroduce D as a supposition and reason my way to S. I've given a model where that's true and it doesn't establish the a priority of. So it's not that Chalmers can just be rejected. What he has to do is say, well, for the argument to actually succeed, you need to be able to do all of this in the absence of the principle, on a notion of suspension that takes away the principle of informational economy. And what I find less clear is that you could engage in that suppositional reasoning without the principle of informational economy. And one thing worth saying is that many approaches to belief revision adopt some version of the principle of informational economy. Even if it's not one that supports the full recovery postulate, they'll endorse some version that says, don't withdraw more information than necessary. And the ones that do withdraw, the more information they withdraw, so there's these models that are called severe withdrawal models, which, I don't know, makes it sound like you've been addicted to something and then you take it away. These models, typically, you can't recover very much, and that makes me very suspicious that if you adopt a principle of belief suspension that takes away too much empirical information, it makes me suspicious that one would be able to reason my way from D to S. So I feel like there's a perfectly good approach where we can engage in this suppositional reasoning. We can reason in the suppositional room from D to S, having suspended our belief in D, and conclude S, and that's true, but it doesn't follow on that perfectly good model that our credence and high credence in S given D is independent of experience. Thank you.
Well, thanks to both of you for your very interesting comments. I had the benefit of having read Bryan's paper in advance, whereas just having heard Gabriel's comments for the first time. So I'll focus mostly on what Bryan said. I'll try to maybe bring in one or two things that Gabriel touched on along the way. I mean, it's a very, very substantial and meaty paper, and actually the written paper even more so. Bryan left out a couple of parts of the written paper that I thought actually had a central role. So maybe some of that can come in the discussion. It's really fascinating to see the application of all this AGM equipment to these issues about front loading and the a priori. I mean, just for a little bit of background, in case it's useful for people. I mean, Gabriel mentioned the relationship between armchair knowledge and a priori knowledge. At this point in constructing the world, I took myself to have given an argument that at least we could have a certain kind of conditional armchair knowledge, that given all that complete physical and phenomenal and so on knowledge of the world, one could thereby reason without going out and gathering more empirical evidence. Given PQTR, you can therefore infer various facts about the existence of tables and the existence of kangaroos and the existence of life and so on. So that, various macroscopic truths I could at least know conditionally on physical, phenomenal information. Whereas, just to connect it to the consciousness case, I wanted to argue that you couldn't come to know all the phenomenal truths just on the basis of physical information alone, even in that way from the armchair. So that was there's a distinctive epistemic gap for consciousness, but once you've got physics and consciousness, not such a distinctive epistemic gap to the other things. But one natural response is to say, well, maybe you can do it from the armchair, but it's still not a priori, because this kind of a priori reasoning is tacitly appealing to empirical background knowledge that all of us have at this stage in our lives. I think Bloch and Stolnicker may have pioneered this strategy for response. By now we've encountered a lot of empirical knowledge, and even our armchair reasoning may be sensitive to that. So this whole front-loading argument was supposed to be a strategy for getting around, for responding to that kind of objection. Whatever empirical evidence E, this strategy basically says it's empirical evidence E. It's crucial in reasoning our way from, say, PQTI to kangaroos, or whatever. But if E is playing that justifying role in the conditional, then all we need to do is front-load. And then think about, what if we suppose E? So if we can reason, if E justifies the reasoning from physical and phenomenal facts to kangaroos, well, now we can suspend judgment in E. Well, then we can add E to our base PQTI and use it explicitly to reason to M. And maybe one could even consider what one can do suspending judgment in E. And I wanted to make the case, even if I suspend judgment and all those relevant empirical claims, I can still reason my way from PQTI to M. And then at this point, that's where Bryan's response comes in, says even if you can do this, that doesn't entail that it's a priori, because we may be tacitly using some empirically justified information still under the surface. And the appeal to AGM is one way of bringing all that. So at this point, I think my conception of belief contraction may be different from Bryan's with this principle of informational economy. I may end up denying the principle of informational economy depending on exactly how it's understood. It's very crucial to my understanding of belief suspension. Is I think somewhat different, at least from the way that Bryan is thinking about it. Here's how I think belief suspension works. When you suspend belief in something, you don't just contract on that very thing, you also contract on all the things that that belief supported. In particular, I only apply this model to evidence claims. And think of all this, I tend to be foundationalist here, so think about all this as applying to foundational evidence. When you contract on evidence, when you suspend judgment about some evidence, you also end up basically suspending on all the things that the evidence supported, at least if the evidence was the essential support for those things. So my conception here of overall belief states is more, because it builds in all these epistemic support relations. And it's absolutely crucial that when you suspend judgment in some evidence, I take away my visual experience on a certain day, suspend judgment on that as my evidence, and whatever propositions about the external world that was grounded essentially in that evidence, that's all I'm going to have to suspend on all that as well. So is that informational economy? Well, there's a way of understanding informational economy where this violates it. It says, well, okay, suspend judgment in the evidence, but keep around all the stuff that the evidence supported, because that's a more minimal mutilation of the belief set. Well, I said, well, if that's what you mean by informational economy, then that's not at all the notion that I want. To me, that's a somewhat unnatural way to think about belief suspension, but be that as it may, that's not how I'm thinking of it. I mean, there's a way in which you can understand my view as a version of informational economy, making the minimal mutilations, but make sure you respect all those evidential support relations. When you do that, then I'd be happy to accept the principle of informational economy understood that way. In any case, I think once you understand belief suspension this way, then the particular worry that you raised doesn't seem to go through. If, for example, we suspended judgment on all of our foundational empirical evidence, you would thereby suspend judgment on everything that foundational empirical evidence supported, and and the possibility that you had in mind that somehow one is going to keep around some empirical stuff that had been supported by that evidence. Well, that's not going to be a possibility. Now, maybe, I mean, this doesn't entirely, of course, this moves the bump in the road to other places. One thing someone might say is that, oh yeah, but in our intuitions about these cases, when we suspend judgments, when you talk about suspending judgment on this stuff and then reasoning, you're still tacitly keeping some of that empirical evidence around, even though you were supposed to get rid of it. And we could argue about that. But in any case, I mean, it's just interesting to think about how these arguments go when you use that notion of belief suspension. I think that your response here is going to be saying, if you use that stronger notion of information, of judgment suspension that comes along with that much contraction of information, then the recovery principle will no longer be plausible. If one actually suspends judgments on not just on the evidence, but all the empirical stuff that supports it, then you'll have lost the resources to recover the conditional from once one reintroduces the evidence. You suspend judgment on all the empirical stuff, you'll be like a little baby again. Just reintroduce all that evidence suppositionally. No, you'll still be stuck with nothing. You're like a baby who's been given a whole bunch of stuff that the baby doesn't know how to use, or something like that is the thought. So this is where I think, I guess this is where I think there's a positive case for the recovery principle. Maybe it goes most straightforwardly if you think about evidence locally, one piece at a time. But then I think if one makes the case for the recovery principle for evidence one piece at a time, one could then extend it to total evidence. And it's the case that you alluded to in the paper, the case involving the knowledge room and the supposition room. Let's take someone who doesn't. I think your view is going to be committed to there being cases of the following form. There's someone without a certain piece of evidence. Once they acquire that evidence as knowledge, they can use it to acquire justified belief in some conclusion, call it C. On the other hand, if someone merely supposes that evidence, then they will not be able to use that to acquire justified conditional belief in C given E. Yes. And I find that combination just very, very, very strange. And this is where the thought experiment of the knowledge room and the supposition room comes in. I mean, the thought is, okay, in one room, you actually tell someone that E is true. Somehow, somehow they get the evidence that E is knowledge, and then they go through some kind of process, and they get to C. In the other room, you do something slightly different. You show them E, but you don't tell them it's true, they merely suppose that E is true. Which sure looks like, at the very least, whatever psychological process someone could go through in the first room to get to C, somebody could also go through in the second room to get to C conditional on E. I mean, maybe there are some weird psychological quirks to human beings, so we do some things better when we're told things than when we're merely supposing things, but it looks like that's probably going to be an artifact of non-ideal reasoning. So it looks like, at least psychologically, knowing E and supposing E ought to be able to get us to the conclusion C equally well, under knowledge in one case, under supposition in the second case. So then, assuming at least the psychology works like that, you're going to be left having to say, well, but yeah, but in the knowledge room, it's justified, because you really know E, and therefore the conclusion C you get to is somehow justified by E, whereas in the supposition room, it's not. It's just a mere bit of psychology. Yeah, if you merely suppose E, yeah, sure, you can reason your way to C given E, but it's not justified in this case, because knowledge of E was somehow essential to grounding the principles that led to the conditional or something. I just find that combination extremely bizarre and counterintuitive. It just looks like knowledge and supposition. It's just very hard to see why knowledge and supposition could work in such different ways. I'd love to see an example of it really work through. You appeal to Schroeder, but it's not really clear that Schroeder does much to diffuse that intuition of the corresponding knowledge room and supposition room. Maybe there's something someone could do about, somehow having an experience does something really special that merely knowing that one's having the experience can't do. And I tried to discuss that a bit in the book. But anyway, my thought is that, at least that combination seems bizarre. I really have to see how those two rooms could come apart. And of course, if they can't come apart for limited bits of evidence, then it looks like just chaining bits of evidence together, one will get to the conclusion. I mean, I agree that somehow if you start by doing it for total evidence all at once, then the mind at least starts to boggle about the case of, the baby who had never acquired all this evidence and so on. But if one does it more limitedly with one piece of evidence at a time, I think one can still get to that case. And unless of course that might raise the suspicion of Sorites effects, but I think to get a Sorites effect off the ground, you'd at least need some difference in the status of the cases. So that, I guess, is where I'm inclined to focus.
So yeah, there was a lot there. I'll try and go through some of it, not all. So the conception of a Credo state I was working with is basically a Credo function plus all these conditional Credo functions. And I mean, a lot of the book has that, just attributes that structure. And one of the interesting things about that structure, two interesting facts about that structure. One is you can get into the same Credo state by acquiring different evidence. And that's one of the problems with removing pieces of information. We don't know which way to go back. Now, what you're proposing is we build in more structure to our description of the Credo state. Not only do we have, so we represent explicitly, first of all, the pieces of evidence that have been updated on, so we know what, and then we represent specific claims being justified by those prior Credo state, by those foundational, by that evidence. So we represent justification relations. And the thought is that's going to give us a story about what to remove. And I think that's right. It will give us a story about what to remove. A lot of models that do that, like the severe withdrawal models, have some features similar to that. They take away so much information that it's often hard. They're specifically motivated by getting rid of anything like recovery, right? So I think that's true. I think that might be a reason you might be hesitant to adopt. So even sort of very weak versions of the recovery, even sort of weakenings of the recovery postulate, they're not going to necessarily support. So one reason I'd have to be a bit skeptical about the kind of model you're proposing, just incidentally, is I'm somewhat of a holist about justification, even if there are specific, so this reveals my Quinean sympathies, even if there are specific justification relations between some claims, like when I infer it's a dog or a cat from it's a dog, that get represented. I mean, I do think there's going to be, once I'm presented with my total information, I holistically infer some beliefs, and there's not going to be any single justification relation that should be represented in my Credo state. So given that, that's a reason I'm just a bit suspicious that that in removing everything that depends on, that is justified by my basic foundational evidence, I'll also remove everything in my Credo state, everything empirical in my Credo state, because I think there's stuff that gets in my Credo state that's somehow holistically justified by my total information. I think you're entirely right that my line will be that if we go with this stronger notion of belief suspension, where it just sucks out everything that's empirically dependent, that we will be like children. And one interesting fact I found about my children is they were very bad at suppositional reasoning. So I think that's okay if
we're going to be super babies.
Yes.
Children who are ideal reasoners.
Right. Right. I guess, I mean, I think we do maybe have different pictures of what we are as rational agents. I think before we get any empirical information, it's just a mess. Like, epistemic possibility is too big for us to have any real beliefs. And it takes a lot of experience, to just like pounding of sensory stimulations to get myself into a state where I have defined conditional credences and I have expectations and things like that. And if you have that picture, then I mean, I can still very much agree with what you say about belief suspension and how that works, and that I can even add things like there are some justification relation, there are some evidence facts that get represented in my creedal state, there are some justification relations, but I still think it's quite plausible that whatever model you have that allows us to engage in the suppositional reasoning as you want should have is going to have some empirical contamination such that it's not going to be a priori. I don't know if that helps at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very helpful on the, certainly on the two pictures. And I certainly see the attraction of the picture where, only light dawns slowly on the whole, and only as you get all this empirical information, can you have beliefs at all, and can you have justified beliefs? But indeed, I'm inclined to think that for having beliefs, certainly having sometimes experience is very essential to having belief, because that's more of an enabling condition. It's the particular line on justification where I want to question the essential role. As I say, I see the attractions of the picture, especially down to the level of global evidence. That's where the local style of argument, say, withdrawing and suspending judgment on bits of experience, bits of evidence, one piece at a time, I think is meant to be something I can use to chisel away at that picture. If after all the recovery principle is false for bits of experience bits of evidence taken one at a time, if the recovery principle is true for bits of evidence taken one piece at a time, and it looks like chaining all those bits of evidence together, it ought to be true as well. At least unless it was, for that to go wrong, it's going to have to have been a little bit false for every little bit of evidence. So somehow, the justification for the conditional belief was a little bit somehow weaker in some Socrates-like way than the justification in the knowledge case. So it's somewhere around there that's, again, I want to appeal to you having, when you committed to a strange conjunction, a certain claim about when you get knowledge of some evidence, and a very different claim about what happens when you merely suppose that evidence, even though it looks like people can straightforwardly, at least an ideal reasoner could go through straightforwardly through the same reasoning in either case. We're very capable of reasoning from suppositions as well as from knowledge, and certainly ideal reasoners are going to be. So you have to say somehow one case it's the suppositional case it's less justified, and that's what looks to me to be the awkward conjunction. You said that models of severe withdrawal don't support recovery. I don't really know whether mine is a severe withdrawal model or a minimal mutilation model. I think it probably depends on the details of spelling out the framework.
So I was wondering about what if you have more to say about how Quine would respond to today's model. Your accounts of belief change were fairly deterministic Bayesian accounts, whereas Quine has this view in which, when you acquire some new evidence, it's tentative, and it could be assimilated in many, many different ways, so making many different changes. And that seems to be very essential to his argument against the a priori. And it seems to be a very different picture from the picture that you've been working on.
Right, thanks. So I do have a view of what Quine says. I developed in a paper with my former colleague, Moritz Schultz. So Quine has this view that any piece of evidence, you can hold on to a theory regardless of the incoming evidence. So if I believe it will rain tomorrow, and you show me, and we wait till tomorrow comes around and you show me that we look out the window and it's clear. Quine thinks it's in principle possible for me to say, well, it's actually raining. It's just that there's a shade in front of the window, et cetera, et cetera. So as a matter of fact, I wouldn't do that, but it's possible for someone to do that. So there's a question about what Quine means when he says one may hold on to a theory come what may, come any piece of evidence, and whether that requires the kind of indeterminacy you're alluding to. Does it mean that I, here I am standing here. You take me to the window, you open the window, and we look out and have this experience of a clear sky, as of a clear sky. Does it mean that I could go either way? Or does it mean I could go one way, and someone else with the same empirical evidence I have could rationally go another way? So Moritz and I say Quine only needs the latter claim to undermine his argument, to undermine the view that anything that is insensitive to empirical refutation is a priori. He only needs that, and analogously to undermine the claim that anything that is irrevisable is a priori. Yeah, that's all he needs. So Moritz and I have a particular reading, which is, I mean, it's also engaging with Dave's argument on revisability. So we have a particular reading of what Quine's doing and what he needs. Now you might have a stronger reading where it's like, what Quine says is you take me to the window and show me, and I could go either way. And we don't think he's committed to that. We don't think he needs to be committed to that to do what he wants to do. And some of the things he says are in tension with that. He says, he talks about how I would go a certain way. And I guess that's compatible with the fact that I would be okay going the other way, but he seems to be saying, well, a lot of times what he does is qualify in a way that says someone could go the other way. Does that answer the question at all? Or?
What really struck me is how the belief models you were employing didn't really have that feature that there was many options that you could assimilate your evidence. When you get tentative evidence, you could be rational to assimilate it in all sorts of different ways.
But I mean, one way of understanding that is you and I could have different priors such that given the same set of experiences, we come to different conclusions. I mean, nothing I said prohibited that, I think, because I mean, I think my basic view is we come into the world with no real priors, so then nothing I've said requires that when we have the same experiences, we thereby have the same.
Yeah, I think this issue is very interesting, and in the paper I wrote on two dogmas, I distinguish between a pragmatist and an empiricist reading of Quine. The pragmatist reading stresses the freedom to revise in different ways for an individual. The empiricist one stresses more the norms of how one should revise. And I guess I'm with Barry on Quine interpretation. I think Quine in two dogmas is naturally read as stressing the pragmatist view about the individual's freedom to either hold on to whatever they want or to get rid of whatever they want. As they choose, their current evidence doesn't, the current state somehow doesn't determine what they should do. But I think there is an empiricist reading of his argument, which is also very interesting. I guess by substantively, I think having read yours and Moritz's paper there, I think our disagreement is going to be about what kind of freedom is required. And maybe for Quine to make his argument against analyticity of certain sentences, then the intersubjective point is good enough that one person can revise one way and the other person can revise another way. But in order to also make a case against the a priority of belief, Quine is often taken as having made an argument against the very notion of a priori, the existence of a priori beliefs, or the tenability of an a priori, a posteriori distinction. For that one, I guess I'm inclined to think he needs to make his arguments work at the level of an individual. One way or the other, merely showing that one person could go one way and a different person could go a different way is not going to make the point against the first person, the a priori of the first person's belief, at least if it's open for people to say, well, these beliefs are relevantly different in relevant epistemic or semantic features. So, I mean, that's probably where that argument is going to come down.
The claims Quine makes explicitly are not the agent relative claims. He doesn't claim any agent may hold true any statement, come what may, and any statement is revisable for any agent. I mean, the text explicitly says any statement can be held true, come what may, and any statement can be subject to revision. So, I mean, I think if you think that I think the text is at least compatible with what I want to say. And there's a way of reading it where that shows that no statement is irrevisable, and therefore if you think irrevisability is a criterion of a priori, he's got an argument that it's that they're revisable. I think there's a pragmatism is said in many ways. I think there's a perfectly good sense in which I'm a pragmatist and I can talk about freedom. It might very well be that considerations of interest, considerations of simplicity, etc., are that I'm reading Quine as a pragmatist. That it might very well be that those things are justifying, and I think insofar as I believe that, that is a pragmatist reading of Quine. Here I am, here I sit, I have certain interests, and those are part of my those are part of what make my experience justify my certain claim, is that I want the simplest theory that I can do X, Y, that I can build bridges with. So I think there's a perfectly good sense in which I'm reading Quine as a pragmatist, although there are other kinds of pragmatists that I'm probably not reading him as.
I think whether or not you're right about Quine, I think you're certainly right about later Quineans, say Putnam and Harman, who I think are very much taking the empiricist line.
Maybe, yeah, just short thing I want to say. Maybe it's just a clarification I want to understand here. Whatever is front-loaded in this a priori thing, right? Does it vary along with change in the set of empirical evidence? Let's say that there is the set of empirical evidence you have, and then it changes a bit here, a bit there, so extract apart, and as you do it, according to your argument, you're gonna have changes in whatever is gonna be front-loaded there. So actually it's not gonna be a priori, right? Because it changes along with this empirical changes. If that's the case, I mean, is this a priori claim, since the what's front-loaded is changing, depending on the set of evidence? Is it indexed to a certain set of evidence? So even if it changes bit by bit, isn't it enough to argue against him? It's just like, oh, yeah, I can get the whole thing off, and then I am baby Marco. I mean, that's a way to frame it, but I guess only the bits are enough, right?
Right, so I take it one of the things you've been saying is, well, look, it's a lot, the suppositional reasoning in the severe case, so suppose I go back to my pure Credo state. It's a lot easier if I say, well, if I go piece by piece, I say, okay, there's wet sensations in your arm, go. There's this stuff people call water, go, etc. But my basic view is, if you tell a baby that there's wet sensations in their arm, or if they feel wet sensation, they get that evidence, like there's not, until they've got a lot of evidence, there's not a lot they can do with that. So even if, this isn't a case where they even have experience of it, right? Babies have lots of experiences, but if you just give them a little bit, they can't really do much. So yeah, I think I'm with Marco that I don't think the drip by drip, I mean, you need to get a lot of priors and you need to get a lot of your credences set before you can start engaging in the suppositional. Are you saying my baby was not a super baby?
All right, I think that's about it. Thank you very much. Thank Bryan.